Okay, let's dive in. Have you ever just stopped and really truly asked yourself, what is reality? I mean, is the world around us this seemingly solid, predictable place actually the way it appears?
Or is there something, I don't know, fundamentally stranger, deeper, maybe even completely different happening beneath the surface?
Exactly. It's maybe the fundamental question.
That's got to be up there, right? From ancient creation stories all the way to quantum physics, which is just baffling. Humans have always wrestled with this. What is real?
Absolutely. We've gathered, well, just a fascinating collection of sources today.
Yeah. What are we looking at?
We're going to explore perspectives from ancient philosophy, then zoom right through modern physics, cutting-edge neuroscience, and even dip into some pretty radical metaphysical ideas.
Wow, okay. Covering the spectrum.
Totally.
Time itself.
Yeah.
And the core idea presented immediately is there is no time.
Yeah, that's definitely a head-turner. How we normally think about time, especially the present moment.
The past and future are just, well, thought.
And it poses that question directly to you, the listener, doesn't it?
It does. It asks, have you ever actually visited that place called the past that you're thinking about?
It's a great question because it challenges our sense of chronology as some kind of physical reality. The source really emphasizes that when we remember the past...
Or think about the future.
Right, or anticipate the future, we're only ever doing that now, in the present. They don't exist somewhere else.
They're just mental activity happening right now.
Precisely. Which naturally leads the source to take a hard look at the now itself.
Yeah, we usually think of now as this tiny, fleeting thing zipping along a timeline.
That's the common picture.
Yeah.
But the source questions that completely. Like, does the now even move? How long does it last?
Is it a second? Less.
These questions about its duration are key because our intuition says it's incredibly short, constantly becoming the past.
But the source just throws that out.
Completely. It asserts the now doesn't last in time at all.
Because?
Well, because, according to this source, there is no time for it to last in.
Wow. Okay. So it's not just short. It's not even a moment in the way we usually mean.
Exactly. It's pushing back hard against seeing the present as just this thin slice between a past and future that it already called unreal.
So if the now isn't a moment sandwiched between nothing, what is it?
This is where it gets really interesting, connecting back to the bigger idea. The source explicitly says the now is not a moment.
Okay.
Instead, it offers this other concept. It says the now is, well, it's eternity.
Eternity, like lasting forever.
See, it clarifies that. It calls it the ever-present, not everlasting, which still implies duration in time.
But ever-present, meaning always here,
Yeah.
outside of time.
That seems to be the idea, something fundamentally present without a start or end point in time. Not a point on a line, but maybe the line itself. Or maybe not even a line.
Something else entirely. Okay, so if the now is this timeless, dimensionless eternity, why do we experience time passing? Why does it feel like moments are ticking by?
Good question. And the source provides this powerful analogy to explain that.
Okay, let's hear it.
It suggests our mind acts like a prism.
A prism, like refracting light, sort of. It takes the now, this dimensionless eternity we were just talking about, and it filters it. Or refracts it, maybe.
And what comes out the other side of this mental prism?
What comes out, what we perceive, is the single dimension that we experience and call time.
So time isn't something out there that we're moving through.
According to this source, no. It's presented more as an appearance, a construct, generated by how our minds process this underlying timeless reality, a perceptual filter, essentially.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive then. The core takeaway from this source is it's pretty radical. Time, as we know it, past, present, future, moments ticking by, isn't the fundamental reality.
Right. It's framed as a product of the mind, a way we perceive something that is actually eternally present.
It definitely challenges, well, pretty much our everyday experience of reality.
It absolutely does. It flips the script on something we usually take for granted.
Structuring this eternal now.
What could that mean about the real nature of, well, everything, about reality? Or even about the potential hidden in how we perceive things.
Yeah.
It
leaves you with some pretty big questions to consider. We'll hit some surprising facts and I hope some real philosophical wonder along the way.
Sounds good. It definitely challenges, well, pretty much everything we take for granted.
It really does.
Yeah.
And we should mention we're once again proudly recording this deep dive right here at KPT Team Studio. It's great to continue this collaboration.
Absolutely. Great space. Okay, so where do we start peeling back these layers? Ancient ideas.
Yeah, let's rewind. How did people traditionally think about the world? One really dominant idea, especially in the West, is what Alan Watts called the ceramic model.
Right, the ceramic model. Okay, so the world as an artifact, like a pot or maybe a table.
Exactly. Something made by an external technician, a potter, a carpenter, an architect. Someone who had a plan before they started working with the material.
And Watts connects this really strongly to religious texts, like Genesis, right?
Yeah, precisely. You have God as the divine craftsman fashioning the universe, God's the technician, and the world itself is seen as basically unintelligent stuff.
Inert matter, like clay that just sits there until it's given form and life from the outside.
Yes, the intelligence, the life, it all comes externally.
Which Watts points out is kind of different from how a really good artist works, isn't it?
Yeah.
They don't just impose their will, they work with the clay, with its own nature.
That's a great point. But this ceramic model, it's about imposition from without.
And that core idea made from outside versus, say, growing from within that seems really fundamental.
It does. And Watts argues we've kind of inherited this view of ourselves, too, as artifacts.
Yeah.
So we ask, how was I made?
Right. Instead of maybe asking, how did I grow, which implies something more organic, unfolding from the inside out, like a plant or something. You see that more in some Eastern philosophies.
That shift changes the whole feeling, doesn't it? Making versus growing. External versus internal.
Totally. And this ceramic model, the made universe, Watts draws this really interesting line connecting it to the political structures it came from.
Oh, yeah. How so? The politics influencing cosmology.
Well, think about it. This idea of a divine maker, a single creator, it really took root in societies run by kings, by monarchs.
Oh, okay. So God is conceived in the image of the king.
Exactly. The ultimate ruler, king of kings, lord of lords. And so our relationship to reality, to God, becomes like a subject to a monarch.
Which leads to, bowing, humility, prostration, that kind of religious posture.
Yeah. Which Watts finds kind of funny, citizens of a republic like the U.S. still operating with a monarchical theory of the universe.
Yeah, it is a bit strange when you frame it like that. And you see it in architecture too, right?
Definitely. A traditional Catholic church, the layout often mirrors a royal court. The altar is like the throne, and basilica literally means house of a king.
Wow. And Protestant churches maybe shifted that image.
Sometimes more towards a courthouse, yeah. The pulpit, like the judge's bench, still an authority figure, just a different kind.
So the big question then is, what happens when you take a political image, a king, a judge, these roles based on power and separation, and you try to map that onto the entire cosmos?
It sets up these deep divides, doesn't it? Creator creation, spirit matter, mind body, splits that later science and philosophy really started to question.
Right, because eventually, especially with science really taking off, that ceramic model started to feel, well, not quite right. Or at least incomplete.
Yeah, it began to morph into something else, what Watts called the fully automatic model.
The automatic model. Okay, so what's that about?
This one's built on the idea of laws of nature, which, interestingly, itself kind of grew out of religious ideas, divine law, logos. The idea that the creator set down rules for how things work, like programming the universe.
But then things took a turn, particularly around the 18th century.
Yeah, the Enlightenment thinkers started asking, do we actually need the lawmaker part of this? Does hypothesizing God help us predict how planets move or chemicals react?
And the answer they came to was, kind of no.
Pretty much. It wasn't a useful variable for scientific prediction, so they did something pretty radical. They dropped the God hypothesis.
But they kept the laws.
Exactly. They kept the idea of fixed, immutable laws governing everything.
So you ditch the divine architect, but you keep the blueprint. Or you fire the king, but the laws of the kingdom remain in force.
Precisely. And this leads to seeing the universe as this giant, intricate mechanism, like a clock or Newton's billiard balls just clicking and clacking according to fixed rules, fully automatic.
And Watts suggests that underneath this automatic view, there's often this lurking idea of reality as just blind energy, unintelligent force.
Yeah, just pure undirected power. Think 19th century scientific materialism, or maybe even Freud's idea of the libido as this raw, blind drive.
Okay, so if the universe is just blind energy following automatic rules, what does that make us, humans, with our values, our reason, our art?
Well, according to that model, kind of just flukes, accidents, like, the monkeys randomly typing Shakespeare, pure chance.
Oof. It feels bleak.
It has some pretty significant, often negative consequences. It fuels this idea of a fundamental conflict, a war between humanity and nature.
How so?
Well, if we're just random accidents in this meaningless machine, then our values, our culture seem fragile, accidental things we have to defend against the mindless processes of nature.
Ah, so we feel we have to fight nature, conquer it, impose our will.
Exactly. We talk about conquering space, conquering mountains. The symbols become things like the rocket ship or the bulldozer tools of domination.
But that whole framing feels so antagonistic and, as Watts points out, kind of illogical if you think about it. We didn't arrive here from somewhere else to battle the planet.
Right. We grew here. We're symptoms of the planet, expressions of it, like apples on an apple tree. The tree doesn't fight the apple.
A world that has humans in it is just a world that peoples. We're part of the process, not separate from it fighting it.
Yeah. And Watt's conclusion is that both these big Western stories, the ceramic one and the automatic one, they tend to leave us feeling alienated, cut off, like we're just these separate little blips running from the hospital to the graveyard.
And that feeling of being a fluke in a blind universe can lead to a lot of unhappiness. He even suggests the automatic model isn't purely scientific, but another kind of myth.
Yeah, a myth may be adopted for convenience, or to feel tough and hard-headed facing the grim facts. Academically fashionable, perhaps, but still a simplification.
That contrast between made and grown, or automatic, keeps coming up. And speaking of what it's all made of, even the scientific picture of matter itself has gotten incredibly weird. It's definitely not inert clay anymore.
Oh, absolutely. What's fascinating is that as physics dug deeper, scientists kind of stopped being able to even answer what is matter, fundamentally.
Really?
Because the deeper you look, the more you realize you can only describe its behavior, its structure, its form. You never find the underlying stuff.
Like zooming into a rock. You see the rock shape, then crystals, then molecules, atoms.
Right, then subatomic particles. But it's always pattern, structure, relationship. You never hit bottom and find some formless goo.
So the stuff itself disappears.
Watts puts it beautifully. He says, stuff is basically how the world looks when our senses are fuzzy, out of focus. When you get clarity, you don't see raw material, you see pattern, intricate, dynamic pattern.
So reality, from this view, isn't formed stuff, it's self-moving pattern, like a dance.
Exactly. A self-designing dance, a complex interplay of forms, not static material that got shaped.
And the atom, the supposed building block, that turned out to be weird too, right? Mostly empty.
Incredibly empty. Rutherford's experiments basically showed a tiny, dense nucleus and electrons orbiting in what's comparatively vast emptiness, like a fly in a cathedral.
Which immediately makes you ask, how does something that's, 99.999% empty space feel solid? How can I knock on this table?
It suggests solidity itself isn't about densely packed stuff, but about forces, energy fields, interactions within that emptiness. It's an emergent property, an illusion of sorts.
And then it got even stranger, with waves.
Yeah, the wave-particle duality. People like de Broglie realized that fundamental things like electrons don't just act like tiny balls, they also act like spread-out waves.
Which is just mind-bending. How can something be a particle and a wave?
Well, Schrödinger developed the math for these electron waves, showing they exist in specific configurations, specific orbits around the nucleus. That explained why Bohr's earlier model of quantized energy levels worked.
So the electrons aren't just little planets, they're more like standing waves, probability clouds.
Kind of, yeah. Max Born interpreted these waves as waves of probability. You can't pinpoint exactly where an electron is, only the likelihood of finding it somewhere.
Okay, my brain hurts already. And it gets deeper.
Oh, yeah. Quantum field theory, QFT, this is the modern picture. It suggests the universe is fundamentally made of fields, pervasive energy fields filling all of space.
Fields, like magnetic fields.
Sort of, but more fundamental. An electron field, a quark field, a Higgs field, and what we perceive as particles, electrons, quarks. They aren't really separate little things.
They're not? What are they then?
They're more like ripples, excitations, or vibrations in these underlying fields, little bundles of energy in the field.
So particles just a bump in a field.
That's a decent way to put it, yeah. And interactions like the Higgs field giving particles mass are interactions between these fields and their excitations.
Wow. Okay. So at the deepest level science can currently see, matter isn't solid stuff at all. It's dynamic patterns, probability waves, field fluctuations, mostly happening in empty space.
Pure activity, pure pattern, pure relationship, not inert material waiting to be pushed around.
Which is a radically different picture from the old ceramic or even automatic models.
Completely. And some perspectives take this even further, suggesting that maybe matter isn't fundamental at all. Maybe it's secondary to something else.
Whoa. Okay, where does that lead if matter isn't the base reality?
Well, this is where we get into thinkers like Donald Hoffman, who pulls from neuroscience and evolution. He proposes that what we call matter might just be how mental activity appears.
Mental activity, like consciousness.
Potentially, yeah. How consciousness or mental phenomena look when observed from a different perspective, or maybe a limited perspective. He argues matter isn't the source of things, it's more like a response or a reading that requires an observer and awareness to even manifest.
So the physical world isn't the ultimate reality, but maybe the visible face of something deeper, something non-physical.
Kind of like a computer interface. Hoffman uses the dashboard analogy. The dials and gauges on your car's dashboard are useful for driving. They represent speed, fuel, temperature.
But they aren't the engine itself. They're a simplified representation.
Exactly. Science is great at describing how the gauges relate to each other, how the fuel gauge goes down as the speedometer goes up, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what the underlying engine is or why the dashboard exists. Hoffman suggests the underlying reality might be conscious agents, and matter is just how their interactions appear on our dashboard.
That is a radical idea, that matter is just the appearance of mind.
It definitely is, and it ties into another huge question. If the physical world is maybe an appearance or depends on an observer, is the reality you perceive actually objective, or is it more like a controlled hallucination?
A controlled hallucination. That sounds dramatic.
It does, but think about history. We were convinced the Earth was flat, convinced the sun went around us, because that's precisely how it looks and feels from our everyday perspective.
True. Our senses can be misleading on a grand scale. Galileo even wondered about things like color and taste.
Yeah. Do they exist in the apple or only in our experience of the apple?
And Hoffman brings in evolution here, right? Saying evolution doesn't care about truth, only survival.
Exactly. His argument is that natural selection doesn't necessarily favor organisms that perceive reality accurately. It favors organisms whose perceptions guide adaptive behavior actions that help them survive and reproduce, whatever the underlying reality might be.
He uses that jewel beetle example, right? The male's trying to mate with beer bottles.
Yeah, it's a perfect, if slightly tragic example. The bottles just happen to exaggerate the key features evolution programmed the beetles to seek. Large, brown, dimpled, glossy. That simple rule usually works for finding females.
But it fails spectacularly with beer bottles. So the beetle's perception is tuned for fitness points, not for seeing objective reality.
Precisely, and his simulations suggest that organisms tuned only to fitness consistently outcompete organisms trying to perceive objective truth, which strongly implies our perception is likely similar.
So our reality is like an interface, a desktop on a computer.
That's the analogy. The icons on your desktop spacetime physical objects, they're useful symbols. They let you interact effectively, write an email, delete a file.
But the icon isn't the reality of the complex code and electronics underneath. It hides that complexity.
Exactly. Evolution, Hoffman argues, gave us a simplified user interface. It guides survival actions within whatever the deeper reality is, but it doesn't show us that reality directly.
And it's not just a passive receiving of data, is it? The brain is actively building this interface.
Massively so. This is where neuroscientists like Anil Seth come in. Perception isn't just bottom-up, signals coming in. Your brain is constantly making predictions, generating its best guess about the causes of those signals based on past experience and internal models.
You don't just see light or hear sound. Your brain interprets and constructs the experience.
Right. Think of optical illusions, like the checkerboard where squares look different colors even when they're identical, just because of how the brain interprets shadow.
Or that experiment with distorted audio, hearing the clear version later, actually changes how you consciously perceived the distorted version the first time you heard it.
Yeah. It demonstrates that perception flows just as much from the inside out from the brain's predictions as from the outside in. Your reality is, in a very real sense, custom-made by your brain.
A controlled hallucination, tuned for survival.
That's the idea. Useful, functional, but not necessarily a transparent window onto reality itself.
Which leads to another interesting concept mentioned in the sources.
Yeah.
Reality as transperspectival.
Yeah, transperspectival. It just means no single viewpoint, no single perspective, whether it's science or philosophy or art or personal experience, can capture the whole picture.
So you need multiple viewpoints.
To get a richer, fuller understanding, yes. You need to see how different perspectives relate. Acknowledge that each holds a piece of the truth, and the bigger picture emerges from integrating them.
Okay, so matter is patterns, perception is an interface. Some sources just jump right off the deep end from here, don't they? Suggesting reality isn't physical at all.
This is where we get into the really radical metaphysical territory. Thinkers like Deepak Chopra often drawing on traditions like Advaita Vedanta.
And what's the core idea there?
The proposal is that reality fundamentally is infinite consciousness, infinite imagination.
Whoa, hold on. So everything. This table, my body, the stars, it's all being imagined right now.
By this one, infinite consciousness, yes, that's the radical claim. Not that it's your personal imagination, but that everything exists within this boundless field of awareness.
So we aren't separate individuals inside reality. We are that consciousness imagining this specific life.
We are expressions, manifestations of that consciousness. Eternal, timeless, just experiencing this particular dream, this particular movie, among infinite possibilities. The universe isn't a box containing things, it's the dream itself.
Chopra calls it a cosmic dream, right? Like a simulation.
Yeah, but emanating from consciousness itself, not a silicon computer, a digital workshop, outside space and time God, cosmic consciousness, whatever term you prefer. He even talks about the universe as information, like zeros and ones, hinting at something like quantum computation at the base of reality.
That's strange formula. 0 = 1 = infinity.
Yeah, it's very metaphorical, but points to this idea that from emptiness, 0, arises totality, 1. And the potential for creation, infinity, is boundless. Nothing becomes everything.
Which has this weird echo with the simulation hypothesis, explored by Kurzgesagt and others, even if the grounding is different.
It does. The simulation hypothesis usually starts with assumptions about advanced civilizations and computing power, if they likely exist and would likely run ancestor simulations.
Then the sheer number of potential simulations makes it statistically probable that we are in one.
That's the argument. And the ant in the amusement park analogy is great. It highlights how little we could possibly guess about the motives or nature of any potential simulators. Our reality might be their equivalent of a screensaver.
And even within physics, there are hints of stranger layers, right? Like antimatter.
Absolutely. Paul Dirac's equations predicted it before it was found. Particles just like ours, but with opposite charge and other properties.
A mere universe, almost.
Potentially. And when matter meets its antimatter counterpart, they annihilate, poof, into pure energy, EMC way. It shows the deep connection between matter and energy.
And even empty space isn't empty. It's seething.
With virtual particles, yeah. Matter and antimatter pairs constantly popping into and out of existence according to quantum rules. The vacuum is this incredibly active quantum foam.
So whether we look at metaphysics or physics, the picture seems to be moving away from separate bits and pieces.
And towards something much more holistic, interconnected. It's about relationships, fields, patterns, entanglement, maybe even consciousness itself.
The observer and observed are linked, like the dancer and the dance.
Exactly. And quantum entanglement is the starkest example from science. You can link two particles, separate them by light years.
And measuring one instantly affects the other, faster than light.
It appears that way, yeah. Einstein hated it, spooky action at a distance, but experiments confirm it. It shows reality is fundamentally non-local. Things are connected in ways that defy our everyday intuition about space and separation.
Which aligns with those philosophical ideas about no truly separate self, that everything is entangled.
It provides a potential physical correlate for that ancient mystical insight, yeah.
Okay, this leads us to time itself. Which Einstein also messed with, didn't he?
Big time. Special relativity showed time isn't absolute. It flows differently depending on your speed. It stretches and shrinks.
The faster you move, the slower your time passes relative to someone stationary. And experiments prove this.
Yep. With particles called muons created high in the atmosphere, they shouldn't live long enough to reach the ground based on their normal lifespan, but because they're moving so fast, their internal clocks slow down relative to us, and they make it. It's real.
And general relativity connected time with space and gravity.
Yeah, gravity isn't just a force pulling things. It's the curvature, the warping of space-time itself by mass and energy. Time literally runs slower, closer to a massive object.
So there's no universal now. My now isn't necessarily your now if we're moving differently or in different gravitational fields.
Nope, no absolute simultaneity across the universe.
Which leads to these weird models of time, like the block universe.
Right. If time is like another dimension woven with space, relativity seems to imply that the past, present, and future all kind of exist simultaneously, like stills in a movie reel.
Which messes with free will, doesn't it? If the future already exists in this block.
That's the philosophical headache, yeah. Is everything predetermined? But quantum mechanics seems to push back against that.
How so? Quantum fuzziness.
Kind of. Quantum mechanics deals with probabilities collapsing into definite outcomes only when measured or interacting. This suggests the present is constantly being created, solidified out of possibilities, rather than just being revealed from a pre-existing future.
So an unfolding present, not a fixed block.
That's one interpretation, and things like loop quantum gravity try to bridge this, picturing space-time itself as being woven quantum by quantum, with now being the edge of that ongoing creation.
And then Chopra throws in another idea, time as an illusion of the separate mind.
Yeah, that time itself only arises because we perceive ourselves as separate, me, from everything else.
Yeah.
If you dissolve that separation, experience pure consciousness, the idea is that time disappears. Consciousness is timeless.
Wow, okay. And amidst all this cosmic weirdness about time and reality, there's just you, your existence.
And the odds of you specifically being here with your unique genetics and history are astronomical. One source calculated it as like 1 in 5.5 trillion.
Which can give you this feeling of destiny, like you had to be put here.
It can feel that way. Or from that radical consciousness perspective, maybe you as eternal awareness have always existed and are simply choosing to experience this particular configuration right now.
Two very different ways to frame that improbable existence.
Very different. And finally, Chopra links suffering back to that idea of the separate ego mind. He suggests suffering is largely recycled. Trauma, resistance, fear, all stemming from feeling separate and vulnerable. By connecting back to the source, pure consciousness, you can potentially transmute that suffering, see it as an opportunity for growth rather than just pain.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Ancient models, empty atoms, waves, fields, interfaces, hallucinations, consciousness, time. So why does any of this abstract stuff actually matter to someone just trying to live their life?
Right. Why should you care?
I think it matters because these ideas, they strike at the very root of our assumptions. Who are we? What is this world? What's the point?
They shake the foundations. What if the solid world isn't solid? What if your perception isn't reality? What if matter emerges from mind? What if all of this is imagination?
Those aren't just intellectual puzzles. They change how you might approach everything. Finding meaning, for instance.
Exactly. If meaning isn't out there hidden in the universe somewhere waiting to be found, but if you are an expression of the source, a co-creator,
then meaning is something you bring forth. Something you create through your choices, your passions, your connections.
That's the implication. It shifts the focus from being a passenger looking for a destination to being the driver, or maybe even the vehicle and the landscape itself. Find your unique path, connect to joy, take leaps of faith.
Realizing life maybe isn't about getting it right on some linear path, but about being engaged and hopefully reasonably happy while you're doing whatever you're doing.
Right. But it's also important to acknowledge, as some sources do, that seriously questioning reality isn't necessarily easy or comfortable.
It can be destabilizing.
Definitely. It can feel like the ground disappearing beneath your feet. Challenging your core beliefs about yourself and the world can trigger fear, disorientation, a kind of dark night of the soul, as the mystics called it.
But maybe that's the necessary process to move beyond just believing concepts and theories.
And towards potentially experiencing reality more directly. Accessing it firsthand, not just through someone else's description or scientific model.
And there's value in the exploration itself, right? Even if our scientific models change, even if our assumptions are often wrong.
Absolutely. Science progresses by questioning and revising, and even things like science fiction play a huge role in expanding our sense of possibility.
So what about the really big implication?
Yeah.
If it's all imagination or a simulation or consciousness, does anything matter? Is it all meaningless?
That's the nihilistic fear that can arise, especially from the ego's perspective. If it's not real in the way I thought, maybe it's worthless.
But the radical view turns that on its head.
Yeah, the view from Chopra or actualize.org isn't nihilism. It's more like you're falling forever into infinite potential, infinite consciousness, which is inherently creativity, joy, love. It's the opposite of meaningless. It's everything.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've taken quite a journey. From ancient ceramic and automatic models.
Through physics discovering empty atoms, probability waves, quantum fields.
To neuroscience suggesting perception is a constructed interface, a controlled hallucination.
And then into these really mind-bending territories, reality as information, as simulation, or maybe fundamentally as consciousness itself, just imagining everything.
It's definitely clear that reality is way more mysterious, complex, and just deeply intriguing, full of that philosophical wonder than our everyday senses let on.
Absolutely. And maybe the biggest takeaway is simply that our normal common sense picture of a solid, predictable, objective world out there, while super useful for, not walking into walls.
Right. It works for getting around.
It works, but it's almost certainly a highly simplified version, maybe even an illusion masking something far deeper, more dynamic, and perhaps profoundly connected to our own awareness.
So let's leave everyone with a final thought to chew on. If the reality you're experiencing right now is sights, sounds, feelings, this very moment is just one possible configuration, one layer of the cosmic dream, one setting on your perceptual dashboard.
What other possibilities, what other layers, what deeper realities might exist just beneath the surface? And how could you maybe, just maybe, begin to perceive them?